How much are you seeing an ability, a desire to write checks at the moment to the startup community you look at?
Yeah, Caroline, thanks for having me again. I would say that generally the climate is thawing right now. 2022 was a really slow year in venture, partly because the public markets took a big step back with the higher interest rates and the desire for companies to achieve profitability, multiples compressed. We're still generally in that climate, but I think the venture community has found a few green shoots, and in particular, you talked in the earlier segment about AI. That's definitely an area where we're seeing a lot of green shoots. But you are seeing some dollars begin to move.
Okay, let's talk about the green shoots in AI, and perhaps the hype cycle, that some would call it. Where in the area of AI, generative AI, where in the building blocks do you want to invest at the moment?
Yeah, I'd say broadly three categories. One are these so-called foundation models. This was what Rachel was talking about earlier, but it is essentially these generative models that are very large, very complex, and they generate text. They can help you search and retrieve. They can summarize and so forth. That's a key area of investment. There's OpenAI, Cohere, companies like that. A second area is what we generally call picks and shovels for AI. These are basically tools, operational tools, training tools that manage large banks of semiconductors, GPUs, and so forth, labeling or data enhancement technologies. All of these are used to create foundation models, or maybe to help the third category, which is AI-powered applications. So these are applications like Notion or Gong, which essentially use pieces of AI inside them to make the application better. All three categories are very interesting, and all of them are drawing reasonable amount of venture capital towards them.
And you've already allocated to that space. Scale AI, of course, one of them, Mike. But Ed, what's interesting is AI just seems to be an outlier here at the moment.
Yeah, you go back to the PitchBook data, the Venture Capital Association data, first 3 months of this year, you have to go back 13 quarters or so to get to that low level of venture-backed funding for startups. And so I guess my question to you, Mike, is why do you go for an industry that's an outlier? What is it that catches your eye when the deck crosses your desk that thinks, tough environment, I better invest in this, though, just in case?
Yeah, I think our experience as Index is that there are a few moments in the history of technology where you see something that is truly transformational and has a long-term impact. I remember early in my career when I first saw a web browser connected to the internet, I had that feeling. Or when the iPhone came out, I had that feeling. And it is that sense of like this technology has a very broad-reaching, deep impact, and we better get in early. Sometimes we might not know what the winners are, but we better get in early to take advantage of the consequential significant changes and impacts and transformations that technology is going to have, and that's certainly what AI feels like today.
One player bringing impact and energy to the private markets is Saudi Arabia, and I bring that up because this week we've been talking about its pledges of investments in the video game space, for example. What is Index's attitude towards Saudi? I think A16, Quatu, they all count Sanabil as an LP, for example. They seem ready to deploy big dollars right now in private startups.
Yeah, they've been around in the business for a while. At Index, we've chosen not to take Middle Eastern money as an LP, and that's an important value for us for an assortment of reasons. Others, I think, particularly they want to raise large funds, find that the deep pockets available in the Middle East are useful to them. They are a player. I think fundamentally, though, the venture business is constituted by Western venture capital firms, at least in our market, that focus on early stage and growth investing, and I think that's going to be the core of the business for a while.
Mike, Ed brings up, therefore, a global story of flow of money. You're a global VC investor. We know you from Europe, too. How much are you looking at opportunities in Europe? How much is the regulatory environment enticing in places like Europe?
For Index Ventures, about 40% to 45% of our dollars that we invest go to Europe. Europe is a very different kind of a market. It's much more distributed than what you experience in the US. We have a bit of a concentration around the Bay Area and New York. And so it requires a different style of investing. But we do see continued very interesting entrepreneurship. And, at least in Index's history, we've seen fantastic stories like Adyen, for example, or Farfetch, which have all come out of Europe and produced fantastic returns for our LPs.
Mike, we go back to that data. lowest level for 13 quarters in the first 3 months of this year, crypto investments dropping. Are we bottoming out, though, to your mind, in your experience looking at these private markets, broadly and in the crypto space?
I would separate the crypto from the mainstream VC market. Okay. I would say that this whole AI phenomenon represents a coming out of the bottom for VC investing. I don't know that we will return to the peaks of 2020 and 2021. Those are some pretty astronomical years. But I think we're beginning to see a pullout from that bottom. Crypto is a very hard one to predict because at the end of the day, it is an up and down market. It has dynamics of its own. And I don't think it's actually representative of the rest of the VC business as much. Whereas I see some of the investing that's happening, particularly in AI, but all the other categories that we talked about, a return to normalcy.